She had exactly one document, one debt, and one evening to make the most powerful man in the county understand that she had not come to ask for anything. The document was folded inside a pocket, sewn into the inner seam of her dress, flat against her ribs, invisible, warm from the heat of her body. The debt was 11 years old and had not, in all that time, been mentioned by the man who owed it. The evening was now. The doors of Aldermore Hall opened at precisely 8 o'clock, and Isadora Vane walked through them. She did not hesitate at the threshold. Hesitation was the thing that got you caught. She had learned this in the solicitor's office years ago, watching process servers and debt collectors and the occasional furious widow negotiate their way past doormen. The ones who paused were the ones who got turned back, the ones who walked with the unhurried certainty of someone who had every right to be exactly where they were. Those were the ones who got inside. She was inside. The hall was everything she had anticipated and nothing she had been prepared for. Candlelight caught the silks of women she did not know, turning them into slow-moving flames. Men moved through the room with the ease of people who had never once needed to explain their presence anywhere, to anyone, for any reason. The air smelled of beeswax and hothouse roses and a particular kind of confidence that is not performed because it has never needed to be. It was a room governed by a grammar she had spent years studying from the outside. She understood every rule of it. She had simply never been invited to speak. She did not need an invitation. She needed 40 minutes, a clear sight line across a crowded room, and for the Count to understand, before the evening was out, that she was real, that she existed, that she had found what her father left behind, and that she was not going to disappear the way her father's claim had been allowed to disappear, quietly, conveniently, into the long silence of a dead man's papers. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and stood near the far window with the ease of someone surveying a room she had chosen. Across that room, Lord Cassius Aldermore stopped talking about railways. He would not remember, later, what had drawn his attention. He had been mid-sentence, something about the western expansion, the cost of laying track through Westholt's hill country, when the sentence simply ended, not because he had finished it, because something at the edge of his vision had made finishing it irrelevant. He turned. A woman he did not recognize stood near the east window in an unadorned bottle-green dress. No jewels, no companion, no card of introduction pressed into anyone's hand. She was looking at the room with a calm, unhurried attention that was more unsettling than any theatrical entrance could have been, because it was the attention of someone who was not seeking approval. She was simply looking, taking stock, the way a person looks at a board before making their first move. "She does not belong in that hall," Cassius said, quietly enough that only the man beside him could hear. His companion agreed immediately. They were both, in ways they wouldn't understand until considerably later, entirely wrong. Cassius was not a cruel man. His staff would have told you that, and the testimony of the people who work in a house is the only testimony that matters on the question of a man's character. He paid fair wages. He did not shout. He had, on 2 occasions that were still quietly remembered in the servants' quarters, intervened when a guest treated a member of his household poorly. But there was a category of person that Cassius Aldermore had never developed the machinery to manage: the person who arrived without signals, without the small readable markers of rank and connection that told a room how to arrange itself around a newcomer. Such people made him uneasy in a way he had never examined closely enough to name. He named it tonight as a problem to be solved, and he set his man Devereux to solving it. Devereux returned 12 minutes later with an expression Cassius could not immediately interpret. "I cannot find her name on the list, my lord." He paused. "But Tobias knows her. Or rather, Tobias says he knows who she is." Cassius looked across the room. The woman in green was, at that moment, accepting a second glass of champagne from a passing tray with the quiet ease of someone who had never once doubted her right to it. "Send Tobias to me," he said. Tobias had been a footman at Aldermore Hall for 31 years. He had stood at this door through 4 seasons of renovations, 2 changes of title, and more gatherings than he could count, each one blurring over time into the general texture of a life spent in service. He had developed, across those decades, the particular talent of the long employed, the ability to see everything while appearing to see nothing. He had seen her the moment she walked in. He had gone very still. He had said nothing for the better part of an hour, because he needed first to understand what she had come to do. He had met her father once, only once, more than a decade ago, on an errand to the village, outside the solicitor's office, in the rain. They had exchanged only the few words that happen between strangers sharing a doorway: weather, the lateness of the hour, the particular misery of wet boots. But Tobias remembered faces the way some people remembered music, completely, without effort, without decay. The woman in his employer's hall had the same dark, unhurried eyes, the same quality of attention, the same stillness that was not passivity. He understood this now with absolute certainty, but its precise opposite. A person fully present and fully prepared, watching and weighing, not yet ready to move. He had known it the moment he saw her. He told Lord Aldermore only what was necessary, that her name was Isadora Vane, that she was the daughter of a man named Arthur Vane of Westholt, that her father had been, at one time, a person of some significance in the county, before circumstances had changed. He did not say what those circumstances were. He did not say what he suspected about why she was here. He watched the Count's face as the name landed, watched for the flicker, the recalibration, the small rearrangement that happens when a piece of information arrives that you were not prepared to receive. It was there, brief, controlled, quickly covered. Tobias had been watching faces in this hall for 31 years. He had seen it. He had noted it. And he had gone back to his post by the door, carrying the weight of it quietly, the way he had always carried the things he knew. Lady Philippa Strone moved first, because she was the kind of woman who understood that the first person to approach a social ambiguity is the one who gets to define it. She was tall, copper-haired, elaborate in arrangement, and absolutely certain of her welcome in every room she entered. The county had long since decided, through the accumulation of small signals and well-timed appearances at Aldermore, that she was the woman the Count would eventually marry. No one had said so directly. No one had needed to. These things calcify on their own, given sufficient time and insufficient contradiction. She approached Isadora with the particular smile of a woman who has decided to be gracious to someone she considers beneath her. Warm enough to be defensible, cool enough to communicate everything that mattered. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, in a voice pitched carefully enough to carry to the 2 women standing nearby. "I am Lady Philippa Strone, and you are—" She left the sentence open, like a door she expected to close again in a moment, once the necessary information had established her own position relative to the newcomer. Isadora looked at her. She did not rush to fill the space Lady Philippa had created. She let the silence sit for precisely one beat, long enough to make it a choice rather than a hesitation. "Isadora Vane," she said. No title, no county of origin, no explanation of how she came to be there, no social landmark to which Philippa could anchor her and thereby rank her. Just a name, offered with the complete serenity of someone who found it entirely sufficient. Lady Philippa's smile stayed exactly where it was. This required, Isadora suspected, some effort. The two women nearby exchanged a glance that was doing considerable work. Across the room, without appearing to, Lord Aldermore watched. She had not always planned to be here, in the sense that the plan had evolved slowly over 8 months, from something closer to raw shock into something she could actually use. She had found the document by accident. She had been sitting at a table in her rented room in the city, working through a box of her father's papers she had not opened until she was ready. Truly ready, in the practical sense, not the emotional one. A cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, old receipts, outdated correspondence, the careful, quietly melancholy archaeology of a life that had ended owing more than it should have. The record had been folded inside a water-damaged ledger, as if placed there deliberately, hidden where someone searching might not look, but accessible to someone who went through everything completely. She had read it once. She had put it down. She had made herself a fresh cup of tea. And then she had read it again, slowly, with the kind of attention you give to something that is rearranging the floor beneath you. What the document described was a debt. Not her father's debt, a debt owed to her father, a substantial sum, borrowed at a moment of private difficulty by a man who had subsequently inherited a title, prospered quietly, and never repaid it. The man's name was written in her father's careful hand. The terms were noted. The date was noted. There were no witnesses, which was, she had come to understand, precisely the point. A private arrangement between two men who trusted each other, one of whom had died, without collecting what was owed to him. She had sat with the arithmetic of it for several minutes before she trusted herself to react. Then she had gone to Mr. Fenwick Crail, a solicitor who had left the firm 2 years before she found the document, who had been during her years there the one person on staff who treated her work as work rather than as a tolerated anomaly. She had gone to him with the record and her calculations and the full account of what she intended to do. He had listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of respect she had learned not to take for granted. When she finished, he had said, "The claim is solid. The strategy is sound. The only thing that can defeat it is if you go in angry." She had told him she was not angry. He had looked at her with the measuring patience of a man who has been a solicitor for 30 years. "Good," he had said. "Stay that way." She spent the supper hour in the music room. She had not been assigned a seat at the long table, which she had anticipated. She had not come expecting to sit at the table. There is a difference between the one who sits and the one who stands near the window with a glass of champagne and an expression of complete composure. The one who sits is managed. The one who stands belongs, in a sense, to no one. The music room, adjoined the dining hall through a set of tall double doors left slightly ajar. She did not intrude. She did not perform her presence. She simply stood near the Broadwood Grand, a beautiful instrument that had not, she could tell from the slight dustiness of the keys, been played in several months, and rested one hand lightly on its surface with a familiarity that suggested she was not encountering a piano for the first time. One of the older gentlemen, emerging early from supper with a glass of port, stopped when he saw her. He looked at the piano. He looked at her hand. "Do you play?" he asked. "I did," she said, without looking up, "once." He stood there a moment longer than he had intended. Then he went back inside and said something to the man beside him, and that man had turned to look through the open doors. And so the quiet fact of her stillness, her presence, the hand on the piano, had begun, almost without her intending it, to travel around the room. She had not raised her voice once. She had not explained herself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation, and she had not yet shown a single person in that hall what she was actually carrying. That was about to change. It was Mrs. Kane who made it happen, a widow in her 70s with sharp eyes and the social confidence of a woman who has outlasted everyone who ever intimidated her. She had been watching Isadora all evening with unconcealed curiosity, and after supper, when the guests moved back through the hall and the formal architecture of the evening began to loosen, she said, "My dear, I'm told you play." Not a question, an invitation. Isadora sat down at the Broadwood without ceremony. No adjusting of the bench, no shuffling of sheet music, no preparatory rituals of the accomplished amateur. She simply placed her hands on the keys and began. What she played was a nocturne, not one the room recognized, something older, quieter, and considerably more difficult, the kind of composition that cannot be faked, that cannot be learned from practice alone. It must be felt. She felt it. The room understood this within the first 4 bars. Conversations did not stop all at once. They slowed, the way water slows before it stills, each voice dropping a degree until the room had quieted around the music, the way a forest quiets around a sound it has not heard before. People turned, not dramatically, gradually, the way attention moves when it is drawn by something genuine rather than performed. Lord Aldermore stood near the fireplace at the far end of the room. He had been speaking with someone about something he would not later be able to recall. He had stopped speaking. He was aware of this. He was also aware that across the room, the woman he had declared did not belong in his hall was producing from an instrument that had sat untouched for most of the year, something that was making the hall rearrange itself around her. Lady Philippa stood very still near the windows. Her expression was working hard to be appreciation, and not quite managing it. Tobias, at his post by the door, watched with his hands folded and his face arranged as it always was. Neutral, correct, but his eyes held something that might, in a different light, have been called relief. The music ended. The room was genuinely silent for a moment, the kind that follows something real, not the polite pause that follows something merely competent. Then the applause began, warm, unfeigned, and Isadora rose from the bench with the same undisturbed composure with which she had sat down. She turned, and for the first time that evening her eyes found his, directly, across the full length of the room, through the candlelight and the gathered crowd, and the 12 feet of Persian carpet between them. She did not smile. She did not look away. She looked at him for precisely long enough to make it clear that the look was intentional. And then she turned to Mrs. Kane, who was saying something warm, and gave the older woman her full attention, as if the moment had not happened at all. But it had happened, and Cassius Aldermore, for the first time in a very long while, did not know what to do next. He knew the name Vane. He had known it the moment Tobias said it, though he had taken considerable care not to let that knowing show on his face. Arthur Vane of Westholt had been a man he encountered exactly once in his life, in a private capacity, at a moment of acute financial difficulty in the first year of his inheritance. A moment he had managed, eventually, and then had allowed himself to file somewhere not quite at the surface of his memory, not forgotten. That would have required a kind of active dishonesty that Cassius was not capable of. Simply set aside. The debt had been private and personal, and the man it was owed to had died. His heir, as far as Cassius had understood, had disappeared entirely from the county. He had allowed himself to believe, over 11 years, that the matter had resolved itself the way unpleasant things sometimes do, through the passage of time and the absence of anyone left to press the claim. But here was the thing about debts. They did not dissolve on their own. They waited, patient and exact, for the person with the right piece of paper to walk through the right door. He touched the letter in his breast pocket. It had arrived that afternoon, from his solicitor Pembridge, thorough and unwelcome in equal measure. The claim had not expired. The document recording the transaction had never been destroyed. And if the daughter of Arthur Vane was alive and in possession of that record, the sum would be considerable. Pembridge had underlined considerable in pencil, with a firmness that suggested he felt the word did not entirely capture the situation. Cassius had put the letter in his pocket. He had come downstairs. He had opened his hall to 40 guests, spoken about railways, and watched a woman walk through his front door carrying nothing visible and everything that mattered. He set down his glass. He crossed the room. Not quickly. Nothing about Cassius Aldermore was quick when he had decided to be deliberate. And he stopped at the correct distance and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Miss Vane, I wonder if you might walk with me for a moment." The candlelight thinned toward the east end of the hall. The noise of the gathering became a low, distant current behind them. Neither of them spoke immediately, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence from the ones she had been managing all evening. This was not a test, or rather, it was, but they were both being tested, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of that had made the whole thing into something more honest. She did not fill the silence. She walked beside him with her hands at her sides and her eyes forward and let it be what it was. He stopped near the alcove by the east window. When he spoke, his voice was level and without performance. "You came here for a reason," he said, "not a question." She appreciated that. She had not planned to tell him tonight. Not directly, not all of it. She had planned to be seen, to establish her presence in his house, among the people who knew him, and to let that presence do its quiet work. But standing here, in the thinning light, with this man looking at her with an attention that was neither hostile nor dismissive, but simply, plainly honest, she recalculated. There are moments when the carefully constructed approach becomes less useful than the truth. She reached into the inner seam of her dress and withdrew the folded document. She held it for a moment without offering it. "My father was Arthur Vane," she said. "You borrowed from him 11 years ago. He died without collecting what you owed. I have spent the better part of a year determining whether what he left me was enough to press the claim." She paused. "It is." He looked at the document in her hand. He did not reach for it. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been half expecting and fully dreading, with a recognition that was neither surprise nor relief, but something between the two, a settling, as if a weight that had been held at a wrong angle for a very long time had finally been set down squarely. "How much?" he said. She told him the figure, not the minimum, the full principal with interest, compounded across 11 years to a number that had, the first time she saw it written, made her sit very still for several minutes before she trusted herself to react. He did not flinch. She noted that carefully. He asked her to give him until morning, not to disappear. He said that directly, with a frankness she had not anticipated, but to consider how to proceed in a way that did not require either of them to perform this conversation in the middle of a room full of people who would make it into something it was not. She looked at him for a long moment. She had no verifiable reason to trust the quality of his attention. She trusted it anyway. "I will be at the Creston Inn until Thursday," she said. "If I have not heard from you by Wednesday evening, I will proceed through proper legal channels." She paused. "I would prefer not to." He held her gaze. "So would I." And that had been the whole of it. She put the document back in her pocket. They walked back toward the gathering. No one who watched them return could have said with certainty whether what had just happened was significant or nothing at all. But Lord Harwick, a broad, florid man who missed very little when he put his mind to it, watched them return from the alcove and noted the particular quality of the silence between them. Not the silence of a concluded argument, not the silence of a social obligation discharged, the silence of two people who have said something real to each other and are still living inside the weight of it. He said nothing, but he watched. It was Tobias who found her, near the end of the evening, when the guests were beginning to call for carriages, and the hall was thinning in the slow, ceremonious way of gatherings that have run their proper course. He came to stand beside her at a slight angle that looked, to anyone watching, like nothing more than a footman attending a guest. His voice was pitched exactly for her ears, and no one else's. "I knew your father," he said. "I met him once, outside Pembridge's office in the village. It was raining." He paused. "He was a good man, patient, careful, the kind who does what he says and says what he means." Another pause. "You have his eyes." She did not speak immediately. There are things that arrive when you are not prepared for them, not because you have failed to prepare, but because some things cannot be braced against. They must simply be received. She received this one quietly, with her chin level and her hands still, and only someone standing very close would have seen the slight shift in her expression, the way something that had been held compressed for a very long time moved briefly toward the surface and was then, gently, deliberately, returned. "Thank you," she said at last. Her voice was steady. Tobias nodded once, the small, decisive nod of a man who has done what he came to do. He moved to withdraw, then he stopped. "He would not have wanted you to be hard about it," he said, still without looking at her. "The claim is right, but how you press it, that's the part that lasts." He returned to his post before she could answer. She stood with his words for a long moment, turning them over the way you turn over something you intend to keep. It was the kind of counsel that comes rarely from the people no one thinks to ask, the ones who have been in the room for decades watching, carrying things they were never invited to say. Tobias had stood at this door for 31 years. He had seen her father once and remembered his eyes. He had watched Cassius Aldermore's face when the name landed and had seen what that face was working not to show. And tonight, of all nights, he had chosen to set one piece of what he carried quietly down. She would not waste it. Wednesday came. No word arrived from Lord Aldermore. Not by morning, not by afternoon, not by the time the light left the sky and the innkeeper's wife brought up a supper tray that Isadora barely touched. She had expected this was possible. She had prepared for it. She sent a brief note to Mr. Fenwick Crail at his city address. 3 words and no elaboration. Proceed as discussed. Then she went to bed, lay in the dark with the document on the nightstand beside her, and did not sleep particularly well, which she had also expected. The following morning she dressed in the same green dress, secured the document in its pocket, and walked back to Aldermore Hall, not to a grand evening gathering, but to the quiet administrative hour of mid-morning, when a house occupied with its own business and the arrival of an unscheduled visitor carries a different weight entirely. Tobias opened the door. He said nothing. He stepped aside with the precise, unreadable courtesy of a man who has been expecting this and has made his private peace with it. She was shown to a small receiving room off the main corridor, not the formal drawing room, not the library, but the functional middle space of a house being asked to deal with something it did not schedule. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap and was still, the way she was always still when something was about to happen, and stillness was the most powerful thing available to her. When Lord Aldermore entered, he was not alone. Beside him was a man she identified immediately as his solicitor, Pembridge, middle-aged, carrying a leather document case with the habitual grip of someone who carries it everywhere. He had the expression of a man who has spent a long night advising his client and is not entirely certain how it ended. Cassius set a document on the table between them, his own document, drawn up in the night, the ink still carrying a slight freshness at the margins. She read it without touching it. It was an acknowledgement, formal, legally precise. The original loan, the accumulated interest, the intention to settle the debt in full within 30 days. And then the second clause, which she had not anticipated. A formal record of Arthur Vane's name, attached to the document as the original creditor. Not merely the settlement of a sum, the restoration of a name. She looked up at Cassius Aldermore. He met her eyes with the directness of someone who has spent a sleepless night arriving at a decision and is not interested in retreating from it. "I should have done this years ago," he said. There was no performance in it, no bid for her forgiveness, no plea for her understanding. Simply a fact offered plainly by a man who had finally decided to be honest about it. She read the document a second time, with the thorough attention of someone who has spent years in a solicitor's office and knows that the place where agreements fail is always in the language rather than the intention. The language was sound. Pembridge knew his work. She set it down, and then she said the thing that was not in any document and could not be made into a clause and would not be recorded by Pembridge in his careful hand. She had known, since Tobias told her in the thinning light, that her father had been a good man, patient and careful, that she needed to say it. So she had been carrying it since then, waiting for the right moment, because there are things that must be said face to face and in stillness, without the noise of a gathering as the frame. "He never spoke of this debt with bitterness," she said. "I found that in his papers, too. Not the record itself, letters written afterward. He believed you would honor it eventually. He wrote that you were a man who understood obligation and that circumstances had made it difficult." She paused. He was not wrong about the obligation. He was perhaps too generous about the timeline. She folded her hands on the table. "I am not here because I am angry. I am here because his name deserved to be attached to something that was honored, and because I was the only person left who could make that happen." She looked at him steadily. "That is all." The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms are quiet after something real has been placed inside them. Then she reached into her pocket and set her father's document on the table beside his. The two papers lay there together, his in fresh ink, hers worn at the creases from 8 months of careful handling. There was something about the image of them side by side that felt, to her, like the closing of a parenthesis that had been open for 11 years. She signed. The news moved through the county the way news always moves, not announced, never directly stated, but present by afternoon, in every drawing room within a 10-mile radius, carried in the register of the half-said thing, the significant pause, the eyebrow raised and quickly lowered. What was understood, which in these circles amounts to the same thing as what was known, was that the woman in green from the gathering at Aldermore Hall had returned the following morning and had remained for the better part of 2 hours, and that Lord Aldermore's solicitor had been present, and that the Lord himself had not appeared in his usual Thursday appointments. Lady Philippa heard it first, from the wife of the man Harwick had whispered to on Thursday afternoon. She received the information with a stillness that was, those who knew her well would have said, not her natural state. She sat for some time after the conversation ended and looked at a point on the wall that was not a painting and not a window, and simply was a wall. She thought about the evening at Aldermore Hall, the woman in green at the piano, the nocturne that had quieted the room, the walk to the alcove and back, the quality of the silence between two people who have said something real to each other. She had seen all of this. She had assessed it, filed it, told herself it was nothing. She understood now, sitting alone in her parlor, that she had made a significant error of evaluation. She rose. She called for her carriage. She had several visits to make before the day was done, and she intended to make them with the composure of a woman who has decided to be gracious about a circumstance she cannot alter. He sent a note to the Creston Inn on Friday morning, 3 lines. It asks nothing except whether she would agree to walk with him in the grounds of Aldermore Hall that afternoon, if she had not yet departed the county. She had not yet departed. She read the note twice, set it on the table beside her untouched breakfast, looked out the window at the autumn garden below, late-season roses still holding their color against the cold, elm trees beginning to show their bones through the thinning leaves. She thought about what Tobias had said, how you press it, that's the part that lasts. She had pressed it well. What came after the pressing was a different question, and one she had not prepared herself to answer. She went. The grounds of Aldermore Hall were magnificent in the way that only very old gardens are, not the studied magnificence of a thing designed to impress, but the accumulated magnificence of 2 centuries of growth and loss and regrowth, of things planted by people long dead that had continued quietly to become extraordinary. They walked along the gravel path that bordered the south garden, and for a time neither of them spoke. The silence was nothing like the silences of 3 days ago. Not a test, not a calculation. Simply 2 people walking in the same direction in the cold afternoon light, with the sound of their footsteps on the gravel, and the smell of damp earth, and late roses, and the distant wood smoke from the house. He asked her how long she had been in the city. She told him. He asked about her work. She told him that too, without the careful editing she had applied to every previous conversation, without managing what she gave and what she withheld, because the withholding, she realized, was no longer serving any purpose. He stopped walking near the far end of the garden, where a stone bench sat beneath an old yew tree, and he turned to face her. "I would like to know you better," he said. "Not as a claimant, not as a problem I failed to anticipate, as the person you actually are, which I suspect is considerably more than I have had the opportunity to understand." He paused. "I am aware I have given you no particular reason to extend that courtesy to me. I am asking anyway." She looked at him in the thin afternoon light, beneath the dark canopy of the yew, the smell of autumn all around them, the house at a comfortable distance. She thought of her father's letters. A man who understands obligation. She thought of the document with her father's name restored to it, sitting now in Pembridge's files, permanent, on record, no longer a secret the world had quietly swallowed. "Ask me again in the spring," she said at last, "when the garden looks like something worth staying for." He looked at her for a moment. Then, quietly, he smiled. It was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him in 4 days. Spring came slowly to Aldermore, as it always does, in houses that hold the cold inside their stone walls longer than the outside world has any patience for. But it came. The roses along the south garden came back first, tentative, then committed, then extravagant in the way of things that have survived a difficult season and intend to make their survival known. The elms along the road put their leaves back on one branch at a time, with the unhurried confidence of trees that have been doing this for a very long time. And the house that sat at the center of it all felt, to those who lived and worked within it, like a place that had quietly, over the winter, become slightly different from what it had been before. Tobias noticed it first. He noticed most things first, by habit and by disposition. What he noticed was that the hall, his hall, the one he had stood in for 31 years, watched fill and empty with the seasons, felt in some quality he could not have named precisely to anyone who asked, but understood completely within himself, like a place that had corrected something. Not a large correction, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that happens when a thing sitting at a slight wrong angle is quietly, without ceremony, set right. He felt it in the rooms. He felt it in the way the staff moved through their days. He felt it most of all in the way Lord Aldermore moved through his own house, still precise, still exacting, but with a quality of ease that had not been there in November, as if something he had been carrying at a slight wrong angle had, for him too, been set down squarely. Isadora came back in April, through the front door, as she always had, through the main entrance, with the same unhurried composure she had carried into this hall on a cold autumn evening 6 months before. Tobias opened the door and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and she walked into Aldermore Hall. It was not full of guests, it was simply itself. Its old stone and its portraits and its Persian carpets and its particular quality of light in the late afternoon, falling in long diagonals through the tall windows and settling on the floor like something that had always been there and intended to remain. Lord Cassius Aldermore was waiting at the far end of the hall. He had not arranged himself. He was simply there, the way people are simply there when they are not performing their presence for anyone. He looked at her as she crossed the room, and she looked at him, and the hall held them both. This hall that had once been told she did not belong in it, with the absolute, indifferent permanence of a place that has seen enough to know that the truest things rarely announce themselves at the door. They simply walk in and stay. Isadora Vane did not arrive at Aldermore Hall with power. She arrived with something rarer than power, a name that deserved to be honored, a mind that had spent years preparing for a single conversation, and the discipline, every day of those years, never to let what had been done to her make her into someone she did not want to become. She collected what was owed. She restored what had been lost. She walked back into that hall in the spring, not as an intruder, not as a claimant, but as herself, which had always been more than enough. Tell me, have you ever fought quietly, patiently, without anyone watching, to make sure that someone who deserved to be remembered was not forgotten? Because the world depends on people like that, and most of them never get a story told about them. This one did. And here is the thing that will stay with you, long after this story ends. Cassius Aldermore had 11 years to do the right thing. He did it in a single sleepless night. not because he was forced to, but because a woman in a green dress walked through his door and refused, with perfect composure, to be anything less than exactly who she was. The question is not whether someone will come for what is owed to you. The question is whether you will still be the person you intended to be when they do.